7 o'clock, so I will call this meeting to order. So we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Are we doing introductions again this week? Yes? I'm Heather Carmichael, community member on the Budget Committee.
Roger Nyquist, school board member.
Brad Wilson, school board member.
Chris Norman, Budget Committee member.
Michael Thompson, school board member.
Budget committee member.
Jane Allgaier, Budget Committee member.
Eric Aganaga, school board director.
Art Business Confidential. Shannon Bite, controller.
Grant Webster, Budget Committee member.
Pete Morris, school board.
Heather Hughes-Efka, HR Director.
Dave Wall and I work in operations.
Jane Nassiger, Business Director.
Andy Gardner, superintendent.
Excuse me, I know I'm out of line, but if you could all speak into your microphones. I do have expensive hearing aids, and I still can't hear you in this one. I really appreciate it.
All right. So we'll move on to approval of the Budget Committee minutes from May 17th.
Madam Chair, I would move to approve as presented.
Second.
All right, so the minutes are approved. Oh, no, sorry. Any opposed? Any discussion? All right, approved. Oh, yeah, you're supposed to all say that. I told you I need the list of how to do this. All right, so we will do the response to questions and any proposed changes. I'll call on Andy and Jane.
If I may, I'd like to just update the memorandum that came from the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House the other day and what that would mean. So the other day, a memorandum came out issued jointly by the President of the Senate and the House Speaker, both Democrats, in the majority, that called for $10.2 billion in funding for education. As well, the governor has separately asked for a separate funding amount of $140 million for the reading initiative. And I think we had originally shown that as $120 million. So that would change that number from about $890,000 to about $1.03 million. So it's an increase to that amount. This is scheduled for May 30th to be amended as House Bill 5015. And would then, and that would be done by the Ways and Means Committee at that time. They have the majority, the people who made this announcement have the majority in both houses, but are struggling to have a quorum in the Senate, which is stopping business from occurring in a regular manner. And there's still impasse as to which bills. The Senate Republicans issued a statement today that said they would come and pass funding bills out. They do not want to come for other business, and that is the impasse. I think there is battling over, you need to come and pass all the bills that are on the docket as opposed to just the funding bills. I think both groups are meeting at this time with Governor Kotek. It is possible that that could extend to a special session. In other words, that the legislative session closes and that they would be called back to a special session, but the same requirements for quorum would exist there as exist now in the House and Senate. So in lieu of that, the governor, they are working on a continuing resolution which would allow funding at least at the current 9.3 billion level. It is possible they could also fund it at the 9.9 billion level that we presented to you in the first place. Interestingly, the funding comes to us, we do not get a payment in June from the state. We do get a double payment in July. We get a single payment the rest of the year until we get back to June. So a double payment in July actually buttresses most districts against that so that business could still occur. And then whatever was finally enacted would then come onto the books. Most districts are fine in terms of that cash flow. So that should not be an issue with the continuing resolution. And I believe since we were able to get our funding from the state recently, that should hold this district in good stead there. The reading initiative is not a funding bill per se, it is a policy bill, and that will have to be worked out how that would come to fruition. That would have to either be attached to a bill in some other form so that that could actually be moved if there is not a broader agreement reached. Most other bills that affect education in the biennium upcoming that have been moving have not as great a chance to pass under the current format. And so there are some that are both good and some that are helpful to this district. An example, there had been a bill that had stayed alive and was moving on to eliminate the ability of districts to contract for substitutes. We use EduStaff. There was a bill that was going to stop that. It is likely then that such a bill like that would not become law in this session. And so there's many others. We could spend a lot of time here doing that. But that is the funding situation. In general, they believe 10.2 is the number, and we can discuss that as we go forward tonight. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about that?
I know we talked about that before. I guess from a budget committee standpoint, where does that leave us as far as deliberations? Can we actually even make a motion to pass a formal budget, or do we need to put one pending final legislative action, or what would be the preference there?
I'll handle that.
So what I would propose is that we would approve the budget as proposed with the understanding that if we learn of additional funding before the budget is adopted, that the priorities we would tell you tonight would be presented to the board to be adopted at an increased level at the 10.2.
Okay, so we can still basically make accommodations for 10.2, just not pass the budget at a specific dollar.
Right,
Okay.
you will not provide the expenditure authority, but you will understand the priorities.
Okay. For the current budget, do we have an actual amount of what that would be as per assessed value or anything like that written down?
For every 100,000, it's about 730,000 to the district.
Okay.
100 million.
100 million, sorry, at the state level. So the total increase for the district, including the initiative, is about 3 million.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Madam Chair, a procedural question. Try to speak into my microphone here. So this exercise of the budget committee is we pass a maximum expenditure amount, right?
Correct.
And so if we do it at the 9.9 level and it becomes 10.2, how again does the budget committee have to come back? Is that something that the school
No,
board does?
the budget would come to the board as approved by the budget committee, and the board would adopt it at the 10.2 level.
Okay.
Any other questions?
And new to this, what, if the budget committee approves a certain amount, and that's based on the priorities that have been shared, and then we find out we get more funding, that goes to the board, so that kind of cuts out half of the budget committee. But I'm just trying to understand, like, what are the implications of that? Or has there ever been a case where that wouldn't be preferred, or you would need more discussion?
So there are often changes between approved and adopted. And so this has happened before. But it's important that you know the dollar amount and you know the priorities. But if the legislation doesn't happen until September, we would do it as a supplemental budget with the board in September. And the budget would be adopted as it is approved by you.
Ben has a question, Ben Rogers.
So just to be clear, but tonight you have the proposed motions in the back here. They will be at the $9.9 billion funding level?
That's correct.
Okay.
So let me play devil's advocate, I guess. The volunteer members of this committee come here, take this very seriously, and to leave here and to have it not know how it ends, I can see from that perspective, maybe a little bit of concern. What would be would an alternative be to approve it at 10.2 without allocating funds beyond 9.9?
That's an option.
Okay. And the consequence of that is you would have to change these numbers in the draft. Okay.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
Just for some historical context, this is certainly not the first year that we've had this challenge. It's actually a good problem to have that we're looking at potentially more funds, but as many years as I've been doing this, it's never quite the exact number. It usually isn't that big a spread. And normally we're not trying to figure out a budget with significantly lower funds that we have to then cut things for that then might get put back later. But you're right, it is frustrating that the budget committee goes through all these mechanizations and we still don't have a number that we're really driving to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the main thing, and I was gonna ask, I believe we sketched out some possible scenarios, or maybe that was a different conversation I had with the superintendent or something between 9.9 and 10.2. I think the most important thing is we should review what that looks like, because it's a different number, but we're not planning to do anything radically different with that between that 9.9 and that 10.2. We have some strong idea what that's going to be.
We'll share
Okay,
the
okay,
proposals
yeah.
tonight.
I think that's the
Thank
key
you,
thing,
Michael.
yeah.
I'm sure we're all completely aware, but we should not forget that we're already at a $3 million deficit. And if we add another, $3 million, we're net, but it's not like there's bound money to go spend. We'd wind up in a balanced position.
Anyone else?
Okay, well, we'll start with questions. And I think that Grant and Roger's point is, a core discussion that the group would need to have, just where we are going to end up. And if we get to the end, I will pull up another slide and we'll kind of talk back through that. One of the questions that was asked is, what do you believe has led to a decline in the teacher experience factor? I think culture is important. I think we just spent time in a behavior committee where mastery of what we're trying to do, we sometimes are doing so much that it becomes a little bit difficult to do that. I think that COVID is certainly important in that as well, as kids come back from COVID and as the adults come back from COVID, right? So that is challenging as well. Focusing on training. And I don't really mean that we're just going to pound people with training, because that's clearly an issue right now, that people feel like they're asked to do a lot of different things and end up being jack of all trades, master of none. And that has a real profound impact on their feeling, or any given school staff's feeling, that they are getting to mastery at something, right? And so that is important. I'm also going to share with you guys the This is the comparative data for our licensed teachers that we generated this fall. And there are several columns on our teaching scale. Are we short?
It looks like we need two more over here.
Right there, there's two extra.
Okay, all right, we're good.
So you will recall the other night that I had shared where we were relative to the comparison districts, and those comparison districts are listed here: David Douglas, Klamath County, McMinnville, Reynolds, Oregon City, Tigard, Tualatin, Westland, Wilsonville, Redmond, Gresham, Barlow, and Springfield. Those are very similar sized districts to us. Many of those have 2 high schools that are 5A, just like the Albany schools. So we have several columns. The first one, the left-hand column, which is on the left hand here, you can see that the beginning of our scale, we are at number 4 out of 11, right? So our teachers start high relative to the average. That's a beginning teacher. If you look at the bottom left cell, which is the second one down, you can see that our teachers who are at the top of the scale are 10th out of 11. So our scale does not top out in the same range that it begins. It's a shorter scale, and we do not compensate as well at the top of the scale. You will recall that classified had the very similar characteristic of paying well to start comparatively, but paying really below average at the top. That is consistent to both. The top right-hand column there is the bottom of the beginning salary for teachers that have, I believe, masters and then 45 hours beyond that. We are 5th out of 11 when we start. Just below that is the top of that scale. And you can see that we are 8th out of 11 at the top of that scale. So in general, our teachers decline over the course of the scale. Each year they advance, but they decline relative to other districts. And so we know that we need to make efforts to change that. And just as we have done with the classified, we're going to need to move on that. I have another piece of information here for you. I'd say I'm going to get better, Ben, but that's the last one I'm going to hand out. So this is just a statistical look at the most senior teachers that we have. And so the top of the columns, the most senior teachers, this takes a look at those, and it basically shows the gap that we have to even get to median. And that's just a statistical representation, because if you look at the top 5 districts there and the amounts, you see a huge spot in the middle where there's kind of a hole, and that's where the median is, and GAPS is below that. And so down below, it's about 2.75% to get to the median. on the far right column. And then in the lower, the bachelor's column, you can see down at the bottom, it's about 1.5% to get to median. There are 2 districts there in blue that have a local option levy. And a local option is districts, and this occurs a lot in the Portland area schools, the metro area. It also occurs in Corvallis, that they have individually passed a levy that allows them to receive funds above the state school fund average. And so there are also a couple of districts in here, David Douglas in particular. David Douglas has 80 plus spoken languages in the district. And so that changes their funding formula significantly as well. And so that represents kind of where we are now. As we go next year to bargain, we are going to do yet another analysis, because some of these districts may have bargained this year. We'll do another analysis and use that as a basis to work in the coming year to come up with something. I think it's just really important that when people are in jobs like education, they need to know that they are not falling behind. They need to know that they don't have a significant gap between them and another nearby district. And so we are going to have to spend time thinking about this and working with people on this so that people can understand when they come to work in gaps that they don't face a growing loss over the years, because it will create turnover, which will undermine any training and collective learning that we do. I think we saw that a little bit tonight. And so that is just going to be an important and fundamental part of what we're doing. So I won't take as long to answer all the others. Superintendent's budget message is mental health professionals are in high demand. Are we confident that we will be able to fill vacancies and retain staff in the budget and mental health positions? I believe I saw today that we do not have an opening in the counselors in the budget. Is that correct? Okay. I think that's it for me on that page.
The next question was about the ODE form that I put in the budget. It just showed the components of our pay. And the question was, it looked like the bottom information was blank. That is true because they don't fill in the bottom of the form until they start making payments. So the next question was on page 14. And the question was, with the decline in projected students for the 23-24 school year, why do we expect ADMR to be higher than in 22-23? We really, the 22-23 budget was budgeted at 10,752 ADMW. I have since reduced that AMW, and that's what you see. I reduced it to 10,669 to avoid a negative May adjustment. And then this, the 23-24 budget, is 10,686 ADMW weighted. And that was based on our best guess based on the October enrollment numbers. So I guess I'll keep going through the questions. If you have questions, you can stop me.
So can I just add,
Yeah.
the 10,000, does everybody here understand what ADMW is, weighted? Okay.
So the next question, page 15, it was function 1510. The question was, why the large increase in the interest investment? So the budgeted interest earnings were increased in this year's budget, but they were based upon what we've actually received. Year to date, we've received approximately 1.2 million. I didn't make the budget that high because I believe we won't have the ESSER dollars. Some of our grants are ending, so we'll have less interest. So that's my best guess at our projected interest. Page 16, item 300. There's a sharp increase in purchase service that appears to be mostly from the uses of EduStaff. So you remember in the budget, the substitutes went from a 100 function to a 300 function. And so the question is, why do we have substitute budget in our facilities? We actually do use substitutes for our custodians. And so that is why that budget's there. It's based on what the actuals are. Also for this question, I'm on the wrong question. The substitute budget is based on, for April, we expended about 240,000. So I took that times the 12 to arrive at our budget.
And is that with using edu staff, or what, how does
Yeah,
that compare to previous substitute budgets?
That is with edu staff.
Okay. I guess I don't know if
It's
there's
hard
more
to
address
compare
here, but-
actual costs to contracted costs. I have to take also into account the payroll costs and the fact that we have more edu staff substitutes than we had employee substitutes.
Okay, thank you.
And Ben, if I could add, one of the things that we found out at the beginning of this year, we do not have a recruiting staff, which they have. And so we started the year having hired several of our subs, and we had no staff. And so one of the arguments for having this is EduStaff actually has a recruiter for the region that lives here in Albany, as an Albany parent, and can recruit year round. That's all they do. So we're hoping to just build a number that can cover our absences.
So Jane, you said you split that over 12 months, but we only have substitutes about 9 months. Did you just annualize the expense to put it over the whole year?
Yes.
Okay.
And one advantage that I did not think about when we were transitioning, we have actually seen in April and in May the cost of exception time cards for teachers having to fill in and sub and take their preps to cover. We've seen a decrease in those. So we know that we are having more success in getting substitutes through edu staff. Heather, is there anything you want to add to the edu staff question?
I don't have the number with me, but we have seen a marked increase in the number of subs who have selected to be able to sub in Albany, because there were individuals already part of edu staff who were working in Corvallis or Lebanon, and we received reports as we were implementing and making the transition. So we have many more people now available to sub. We have seen a decrease or an increase in people picking up jobs. Not all jobs are being filled. They're not being filled anywhere, but we have more people now picking up those positions. There's some high days, but in general, we've seen an improvement numbers-wise.
And just to highlight, I think something that you said, that this is allowing teachers to take more of their prep times instead of having to sub during those hours, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
So the next question was, what is...
Grant has a question.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, Grant.
Can you help me understand from a budgetary dollar standpoint, when you annualize it, how many substitutes a month are we talking? I'm just trying to get a mental grasp for how many we have working in the district over the course of a month or a week.
I don't know the number of subs. I know the dollars we pay per month, but I don't know the number of actual substitutes.
Yeah, I just wanted
I mean, I could look
I
it
just
up.
wanted
I
to
could
triangulate
get
it
that
down.
back to you.
Okay, thank you.
The next question was, what is the tuition expenses budgeted for? And it was a variety of things. We pay tuition expense for our online students. We pay LBCC for our 3 high schools. And we have a Grow Your Own grant that allows us to pay tuition costs for our employees. And the next question, page 19, objects 655 and 659. And the question is, to the extent that this area can be discussed in public, why were there amounts of money budgeted in judgments and settlements and insurance and judgments? So when I was building the budget, I didn't just go by this year's current budget. I also went by expenditures that were incurred. And so this was one of those, there was not a budget in 22-23, but we had expenditures. So I made the budget to match what I believe projected expenditures would be. Any more questions on that one? So the next one was a question about objects 810 and 820, and that is the contingency that helps us establish our ending fund balance. And I did increase that because I increased our beginning fund balance to 15 million. I wanted to ensure that we would end with 12 million, 12.5. And so that is why I increased both the contingency and the unappropriated reserve. And contingency, with the action of the board, can be transferred to a 2,000 function or a 1,000 function. Say we have more students come than we've budgeted, we can ask the board to do an appropriation transfer with contingency. The 820, however, is purely reserve and will be carried forward. Go ahead, Chris.
So I don't see the 2020 and 2021 and 2022 contingency amounts. Do we know what those were? Were those in a different fund line?
They aren't there because those are actuals and you don't expend those.
Okay. I'm curious out of if we have any history on what the contingency fund was, to know where 2.7 versus 4 versus.
I could look it up.
Okay. It's not.
I know
mean,
that they were around 10 million, if I remember right, between 10 and 11 million.
Okay.
The next question referenced page 21 and functions 1291 and 1295. They wanted to know the difference between those. And I had to look it up in our state book, but 1291 is functions that are provided for our ELL students in the acquisition of the English language that are directly in place through the ORS 336. In other words, the state provides us additional weighting for our ELL students under that function 1291. 1295 is functions not directly supported by that ORS statute, but are providing support for those students. Next one, page 35, item 111, which is salaries. Are health services positions being eliminated? And the answer is no. We moved 3 nurses into the ESSER grant to help reduce salary expenditures in the general fund. Page 45, item 2542. This is what I was answering on the other edge of staff question. We do have contracted classified substitutes for our custodians. And page 69, the ESSER fund, that is the capital construction projects that I discussed with you during our first meeting.
Question?
Yes.
The ESSER grant runs out at a certain point, right?
Right.
So eventually we have to move those health services positions back
That
somewhere
is
else?
correct.
Okay.
Dana, we'll talk about that in our priorities, how that will move.
Page 103, item 295. 295 is our food services fund. 1612 is a lunch revenue object. And they wanted to know why that is budgeted when it was not last year. I budgeted that based on what we have received so far this year. We've received $214,000 year to date. And it could have been left off the budget because through COVID food services, we did not receive lunch services. Page 35, item 111-420, 5,300. So Fund 420 has a negative balance of $200,000. That was left over from the South Albany High School fire construction bond. And so I budgeted $200,000 because I think if we sell the transportation building, we'll be able to pay off the transportation construction cost and hopefully have $200,000 to zero out this debt. So that was the plan. Object 382, why has legal services budget been increased? Sort of the same answer as a couple other ones. I did it based on actual expenditures that I see. Year to date, we have expended $68,000. We use attorneys for various different reasons. We use them in our bargaining. And currently this year, we are bargaining with both groups. Why does the booklet show all budget committee appointed community members' terms are ending in 6/30/23? Actually, that is a little bit of an error. Heather's term was extended by the board. So, thank you, Heather. But the other member's term does end in 6/30, and so we'll follow OSBA's procedures in filling those vacant positions through our board.
I was only appointed last year, so that can't be true, right? 3 years?
The term is 3 years.
Okay.
Correct that.
I think some of them end in 2025, same 6.
Yeah, I would.
Is that right?
I don't know that those numbers are correct.
You just don't want to be here
Numbers
alone.
I was given.
I'm sure mine is wrong.
If I recall what we were doing at the time, I think we were trying to balance it so that we had approximately like, it'd be 2 members one period, 2 years later, it'd be 3 members and try to balance it. It got a little out of balance, and I think that's why Heather's was extended to make that balance happen.
Okay. So since we're on the topic, whose term is incorrect in that report?
Dana.
Just Dana? Okay.
Is Ben's correct? I thought
Yeah,
you.
this is my 3rd year.
Oh, okay. Time flies so fast.
Thank you.
Grant, is this your 3rd year?
2nd year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Grant's needs to change too.
Yeah. I knew someone else was.
You're just being real quiet over there. I didn't know if you.
I was gonna go home and double check.
Yeah. I thought he was near too.
The next question was about positions being filled, and there are vacancies in the budget. Most of our teacher vacancies are in the special education area. So the FTE listed in the budget, it's really a picture in time because we're always having employee changes. And so our goal is just to capture the position, whether it's filled or it's vacant. And we believe that we have done that.
And I would just add, the special education area is a crisis statewide. Krista has a really steep job right now. We're working with the teachers union at this point to figure out how we can fill some of these and yet leave some open. We do have the option of contracting. That's at a little different rate. But primary, it's hugely important that we get teachers ready to serve the kids.
And I think we talked about this question. When I looked at the counseling positions today, I do not see any vacant counseling positions. I know that maybe principals have been creative and used other, if they could not get counselors, maybe hired instructional support or have done some things like that. Next question, are there upcoming capital projects? The answer is yes. We have capital projects in our ESSER fund, and we have the remaining bond projects. And I thought about putting all those projects up, but I think I just refer you to the board presentations to look at the bond projects. Whoops. Another question about FTE. I think I'm going to let that go till the following graph that I have. What caused the bus facility to increase? That budget covers projected lease cost. I increased it because we are planning on leasing 5 additional buses. What is internal services fund? That is a fund I added this year to provide expenditure authority for the district unemployment expenses. And this, I had 3, 4, 5 questions about salary expenditures and FTE. So that is why I decided to put this up there. So the first thing I want you to look at, that blue highlighted line that says licensed salaries. If you look at the FTE in the green column, it is 15 FTE less than our budgeted FTE. And that represents the 12 teachers that were taken out of the budget and the 3 curriculum TOSAs. The classified isn't as neat. So the green column represents budget. The first blue column is the 22-23 budget. Current FTE means what I see in our financial system today. Budgeted FTE is the 22-23 FTE. So you can see a difference in the classified. Budgeted's 563 projected. Actual is lower, and budgeted last year was 573. So the numbers go up and down. And then the other thing I wanted to see, on the document I handed out to you, I highlighted some reasons that when we look at our total projected salary and benefits, they are almost 99%. And if you look at the lines on the document handed out to you, did you all get this? When do you look at the additional salary licensed? For 22-23, it's $824,000 budgeted, but expenses year to date are $1.5 million. So the difference between the 824 and the 1.5 is exception time cards. It's non-position extra duty. So Saturday school, after school, extra trainings, coaches, game duty, list goes on and on. I mean, they're good things, but they're not budgeted through a position. And they also represent, of course, teachers providing sub time. So that impacts that top number. Now, a way to fix that, if I had really paid attention to this before I made the budget, I would have increased the budget more to match what I believed extra time would be. Any questions on that?
So, Madam Chair, I do. Getting back to follow-up from our last meeting, and that how can we be running at 100% of a budget for payroll when we know we have vacancies? I don't know if the vacancies are 2% or 3% or 5%. And so I take it the answer to that question is the yellow line that you've highlighted here that you just described.
Yes.
From an expense standpoint, is that a manageable number? I mean, is that just what it takes to effectively run a school in a school district?
So it's a goal of mine to really learn that and work with our principals next year, because I have one full-time payroll person. Their main job is processing exception time cards that are not the exception.
Okay. We'll stay tuned, I guess.
Yes.
Do we expect I'm kind of thinking the exception time equates to overtime?
Not for our licensed staff.
Okay, so
And not always for our classified either, because many of them are 6-hour positions. You know, exception time card will be generated, a bus is late, and we need the classified staff to stay with the students. And like I said, many of those are really good reasons. Saturday school, after school, Red Hawk Rising. You know, I was just flipping through the exception time cards. They're good things for our students.
So we're able to get out of having a lot of exception processing? Or how, because I don't see the need going away, I guess.
No. One thing I would like to do, if we know a classified employee is going to be covering bus duty 4 out of 5 days, we could increase that employee's time by 15 minutes and avoid the exception time cards. That's the type of thing I would like to learn and work with our principals. Next question, why 200,000 on copier rentals, or perhaps an industry partner could donate office copiers, printers? So we have copier printers in all of our schools. Some of them we lease, some of them we own. But the copy cost you see is also the cost of making the copies, the cost of the toners, everything that goes with that. I actually did reduce the budget this year because I looked at our current expenses and was able to reduce that budget. Page 22, why is warehousing plus courier going from 24,000 to 96,000? My best guess is I do not see one FTE in last year's budget, but that FTE existed. So that makes the difference. Textbook adoption, we do not have textbook adoption in this 23-24 budget. Textbook annual needs is 800,000 in the ESSER fund, and that's another one of those that we need to prioritize and get into our general fund. And it's you.
So the positions for the TOSAs that were eliminated were the subject matter TOSAs that exist, for example, to serve social studies or to serve mathematics curriculum. They are not we did not cut the MTSS coordinator. We did not cut the coaches in the buildings.
I do know that Sue and Stafford are both working with their principals on this, the staff that are being let go, the staff that are transitioning and shifting to keep our systems in place as much as possible. They're working really hard with that. Had a question about the district's preschools. We have 4 preschools. 3 of them are funded through our Preschool Promise Grant. The Tangent Preschool is funded under the SIA grant. And the South Shore Preschool serves 17 students, 1 licensed, 2 classified. Sunrise serves 18 students, 1 licensed staff, 2 classified. Tangent, 17 students, 1 licensed, 2 classified. Waverly, we actually have 3 classified because the students needed extra support. And Bonnie manages our preschool programs and actually put these slides together for me.
Does this include the preschool that was done between us and the city?
No.
Okay, so we have 5?
We will, yes.
And that is out of the SIA fund, along with Tangent. They are not paid for by the preschool promise.
Okay, I was just curious why it wasn't on here, that's all.
Because I forgot to put it on there.
Oh, all good. I just know that cost is coming to us, though. The
Yeah, and
city's
we
starting
have
to
accounted
step
for that. Yep.
back from it. Okay.
Well, we have actually provided the fiscal support for the staff for 2 years now. When the city, 3 years ago, I think, had said they were not going to do it, the SIA funds were coming available at that time, and we stepped in. The city is now stepping, we have one more transition year and then a decision point next year on that.
I guess I just wanted to see the numbers for the city contracted preschool.
So I can tell you, Eric, the contract for next year, 440,000, is actually being paid out of SIA in the 22-23 school year, so that it will not impact 23-24. And like Andy said, then we will look and evaluate going forward.
So what was the number for Meadow Lawn?
Maple Lawn, 440.
So more than the 3 other preschools put together.
You go back.
It was like 436 for 3 preschools?
Is that each or is that?
Plus the 145.
Yes.
Yes.
It's a bad deal. It's a bad, you can send your kid to Santiam Christian for that amount all year long as a middle school. And I would highly recommend the board do further investigation. It's an important thing. I'm a big pusher of preschool. I was the one who got South Shore on here last year. But it's a bad deal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
How many students are Maple Lawn?
I believe 85. So there's a lot of kids served there that the city had pointed them to us on the understanding early. We will shoulder it, but we will certainly be back at this table next year discussing it.
One of the most important things that we did when we did Sunrise, Tangent, Waverly, and South Shore was to find the populations in our district that needed it the most. That was one of the really important things. And I think that would be important for the board in the future to look forward and find other places that might be more prominent that we need to support our community.
Acknowledged.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions on that?
I also had a question on PERS costs. So this chart reflects the PERS cost, actual and projected. So 1920, 2021 are a biennium, and the PERS rate would have been the same. The PERS rate would have increased the next biennium, 21, 22, and 22, 23. And I'm not sure why 21, 22 is so low. I double checked that number. Part of the difference is it's actuals, 22, 23 is budget, 23, 24 is budget. And the rate increase for next year is like 1.3%. So not a lot.
Oh, go ahead.
Madam Chair, I have PERS questions. And so what's the rate as a percent of payroll?
I think it's like 28. That's a guess. I will want to double check that for you.
Okay. I'll wait for the rest. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Question?
This was just a slide I wanted to clarify. We had a question at the first meeting, what was contained. And have 5% budgeted for all classified, and that includes the step and COLA. An MOU that will be paid this June has been agreed to for the positions that were determined to be difficult to fill. We worked with the union. Heather worked with the union for several months. And that 5% increase to the salary schedule was carried forward into the 23-24 budget, and that created the 8% increase for some classified. Student body fund. So there was a question about the student body fund, and also when I read the minutes from your previous budget meeting, I realized that that transfer really was planned to be put into the general fund, not the 270 fund as it is now. So as we change the budget, when the board adopts it, I would propose to change the 270 fund, where the SIA transfer would basically go away. We would shift FTE from the general fund to the SIA fund and move the $280,000 as a direct expense for our high schools. So the cost of helmets, coaches, whatever would directly come out of 1132 in the general fund. That will be, I was visiting with Dave about that with SIA, and you really don't want transfers out of a grant. It's difficult to report, difficult to track. And the other change that I would propose to you is that we establish a small grant fund for South and West and Albany options and get the grants out of the 270 fund. Any questions on that?
Yeah,
Chris?
on that last suggestion, do you need board or budget committee approval to move that out?
I want it to be acknowledged by the budget committee that they approve this change.
Okay.
Do we need to do that now, or do we do that at the end?
And
Okay.
And then I have one more change. As I was, after I submitted the budget for printing, I learned some more things and was working on our debt service for the transportation building. And currently, it is in our capital projects fund, which for this current year is correct because the debt is being paid there from the sale of the building. And so the debt will be reimbursed through the transportation grant once we're able to claim depreciation. We moved into the building in January, and so until the 23-24 school year, we will not be able to claim depreciation. So for the 22-23 year, the budget's correct, but I need to fix it and put it into a debt service fund going forward. I visited with our auditor about this, about the best way to do it, and this was her recommendation. So I would like also for the budget committee to approve the debt service recommendation.
Right.
Are there questions about that? I know it's kind of gray.
I'm a little bit curious what happens after you outrun your depreciation life.
I think the debt service will be paid off before that, actually.
Okay. Thank you.
Back to you.
All right, opening up the floor for questions.
Just real quick, could you go back 2 slides? I didn't finish my note.
Whoops. We weren't.
That was it.
That's right, we need to cover that. You're going forward.
Yeah, this one, thank you. Thanks, I got it.
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, thank you. The showstopper in this presentation for me is the document that was handed out that shows compensation. I look at that and I see a starting teacher almost throughout the state makes less than $45,000. And we're asking them to do a lot. It requires a lot of training. It requires talent. And based on the wage inflation throughout the state in the last 2-3 years, it's lacking. It's cringeworthy to me. And it's nice that we're 4th of 11, and I guess we're competitive with other districts, but 4th of not very good is 4th of not very good. When I add the PERS costs of 28%, it moves up and it looks a little bit better. And then so I guess are the medical insurance programs throughout school districts apples to apples comparison? How do we rate? What are the copays? How good is the medical insurance program we offer here?
Almost every district in the state uses OEBB insurance and has the same plans.
Okay. And so as we move to people who have been here longer, not being as competitive is not comforting either. We should strive to have the best talent in the state teaching our kids. And to do that, we have to be competitive compensation-wise. We, in my view, should strive to be the top, the best. And we all districts get basically the same amount of money. And so the districts that win in attracting talent are the districts that run the most efficient operations, flattest, if you will, in the way of management and administration, right?
Yeah, I think the weighted formula challenges that a little bit, and local option does as well. You get 1.5 funding for language learners. So a district that has a large number of language learners generally has a different total budget number that, we don't necessarily have an advantage there.
So, and the other thing that strikes me is while we're competing, with other districts in the state, competitive, I guess, if you will, I don't think we're competing very well against the private sector. And do we ever look at that? Is there a comparative analysis of that? And I suppose if we don't like that number, what is it we can do about it?
That's a great question. We have never really compared, I don't think, as school districts against private sector activities. The level of education that a teacher requires, a master's degree, for example, if you looked at that for an accountant, they would have a much higher entry number and a much quicker rise to a higher end salary compared to us. But there are fewer of them in any given city, and so then it's the burden on the populace.
So I guess my question is, what's the timing and the process that we strategically build this thing in the best way possible to free up as much money as possible to things related to the classroom, so we can recruit and retain the best that we can? My sense is that over time, the way we fund education and the cost of personnel in this state is spring-loaded to not be, the trend lines don't work. And so at the very least, we could be at the high end of that, so that gets corrected before we feel the impacts that some districts that might not be running as efficiently get.
Yeah, I think that there are some economics that limit that. Salem Kaiser, for example, in this region has higher salaries. They would be at the top of all these scales. But they don't have a local option. And so what that looks like then often is, I believe their kindergarten numbers are around 30, where we have a lower number than that by, a third. So they get to a higher salary, but there is a cost associated with the educational environment there because there are fewer people in the classrooms. So that kind of is a bit of a teeter-totter there. One goes up, the other goes down.
So this is the budget committee, and we're allocating funds, and this is where we would be strategic, if you will, but there's, I guess, a lot of research and homework and ramping up to get to that.
Yeah, I think that, like, we would be open to that, and I think I mentioned earlier, we were going to look at seeing where people are again, because these numbers could change. Obviously, some people would be bargaining right now. We will see where we are and begin to move and make plans for that. But the challenge will be, Roger, where will it all fit in order to, like if we said, here's our target and we're going to go up to this level, that then would take an amount out of the budget that we would have to think about our systems, our custodial. I think we're still short in some of those areas. And so we'll have to be very thoughtful. This is kind of a way station on a 2-year budget process to balance ourselves out.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just gonna, you want to finish your comment, Roger? If I may, Madam Chair. Related to that, I think, Andy, you made an interesting comment, because one of the questions I was gonna have is, this is really good to compare apples to apples, right? It's good to have other districts relatively our size. The reality, though, is if you live in Albany, you can drive to Salem or Corvallis or another district. And so it isn't just that we have to be concerned about where we fit in the other, 11 districts. The reality is they're going to find, if they want to leave the district, they would find maybe something and not have to move. And I think that, yeah, strategically we need to figure out how we move that. But I also think it isn't necessarily just salaries. And you made an important point. For some teachers, not having 30 kids in a classroom is worth 20% of their pay that they don't have to pay on, mental health or whatever, because that's really challenging for that many kindergartners. And so in some ways, I don't want to necessarily focus like we've got to get up to number 1 or 2. I agree, Roger, we absolutely need to increase that number. But I'd also be curious to know from the feedback of our staff, what is really the most important? Is it class size? Is it benefits? Is it administration support? Is it other tools in the classroom beyond just what's in their paycheck? Paycheck is very important. We need to move that up as well, but I don't want to make the only focus beyond that and have class size increase because that's what the committee said, this is the only goal we want to shoot for.
So there's a book by Daniel Pink called Drive, and it says that people who work in jobs like teaching, which is not like piecework, where you can begin to work fast like a person who ties flies commercially or something like that, they can get to where they really whip them out, and there's an incentive there. They can get faster and better. The incentive, like we used to have a lot of debate in education about some sort of performance incentive, but we didn't. For example, woodshop teacher, I didn't think it would be a growth goal that we would incentivize. I thought it would be a no law school, fingers, right? So those sort of things. But essentially what Daniel Pink says is that if you can take care of people so that they know that they are reasonably compensated and not falling behind, that the 3 things that keep them are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think we have great purpose in education. People who want to be teachers are doing it because they love their job. They see value in it. But I do think that the union has some right to discuss autonomy. What level do they have to make decisions as either grade level groups or singly in the classroom? Because they have to when they're in there leading a classroom and no one else is around. And so those sort of things, I think, we have to actually think about as well, right? So compensate fairly and make sure that our structure and our systems allow whole buildings and individual teachers to get good at things together.
Any other questions?
Chair Carmichael, can we, before
Do we
Mr.
want to move
Nyquist,
on?
well, we just wanted to share with you our proposed levels of funding and what we would do with those.
Yes.
And so we had talked, so one of the things I want to make clear here, it is possible that we could get additional 100 million, additional 200 million, or additional 300 million, and not get the reading initiative because it is a policy. And so no matter how things play, what we would ask that you guys consider, if we didn't get the reading, we would essentially be looking to pay for our ongoing curriculum first. And the reason for that is supporting the curriculum that we have now. And we cannot do without that. It supports our MTSS system. And we are encumbered on some of these things like online curriculum access, those sort of things. And so that would be a first priority that we would add back. The second one is FTE costs. We are looking at those not to just put a list of direct add backs in here. There were about 30 positions, as I recall. We can't get all that done. What we would propose is that we have reserve positions for places where, for example, enrollment might surprise us, so that we are ready to allocate should we see that, because we have reduced some positions.
So even with the extra funds?
That is the extra funds.
Right, so if we had, if we get those extra funds, then the idea is not that we bring those positions back.
We would probably present, when we get this finally and the board would adopt, we would propose, here are 2 FTE positions, about $100,000 apiece for elementary. And just kind of broadly say that, but we wouldn't be able to say the school until we see the students arrive, and then we would allocate those out. It is possible that you could actually have a savings there too if we didn't need them all. The third priority, reserve and not spend it. What that would do is by the end of the second year, you would see 1.5 million more. Finally, if we got to the fourth, and that would require the reading initiative and the 10-2 to get to this level, we would move the ESSER, full-time employment, nurses, custodial, and the summer school to the general fund.
Thank you. So if we move that out of the ESSER, then where's the ESSER money go? I mean,
ahead, Jim.
you're kind of not answering. I mean,
No, she's got an answer.
So it will allow us, we're going to target one-time expenditures. We need to replace teacher computers and we need to purchase Chromebooks. So that would be the first priority of putting into ESSER.
okay, so we'd take money out of ESSER and do that with it. Okay. Thank you.
Because ESSER is a one-time fund, and those are one-time costs. The district faced a real challenge during COVID to get Chromebooks out to every student. In the process of doing that, desktop computers were not replaced. Our desktops face obsolescence next year because they have Windows 10, which will go out of service, and we're going to need to update those. So that's a one-time cost. So it helps us to have one-time costs in the one-time fund.
How much does the district explore? I brought this up about the printers and copiers because down the road we have a printing company. as well as making PCs, right? And we have programs where we, this is HP, we have programs where we work with communities to donate these kinds of things. I have reached out to people in the district before and not gotten a response. I would like to start that partnership because I've been pushing for HP to look at Albany because that is where we can make the most impact for the population. Corvallis is kind of taken care of and smaller, and we have plenty of employees that live in Albany, and we promoted the foundation's event last year, the gala. So I think that this is aligned, but I need to know how and who to talk to so that I can make this happen. I think there are opportunities to take it out of the budget because we have industry partners that could help. So just want to put that out there. I'm not speaking for the company per se, right? But it is an inroad.
It would be worth exploring. We'd be interested in that. Thank you. I think we should go to the next slide. I think the last one.
Ben has a question.
I do have one question. So at the last school board meeting, at the very end, there was a brief discussion on how the layoff process would work. I'm wondering how an increase in funds would affect that discussion.
So as Heather asked, and we responded, we do not intend to, with 30-some positions, we could spend all of this, and that may bring everything back. But the other thing I think it's important to understand, we're down about 400 students as well. And so the idea that we would hold positions only for the callback, obviously if there were some people, but we don't believe that there are going to be very many people who actually result in a slip. And Heather might be able to speak a little more to that.
Working through all the positions right now, who is turning in resignations and retirement. So there's a loss of a position or a loss of a person. And the goal is to not lose any people, but perhaps adjust and transition where they're at, working with the open positions that we have. So being able to absorb the loss of positions through those no longer with us and keeping the people and moving them. Those are the discussions smack in the middle of looking at that with the budgets that we're getting and the guidance that we're getting. And I don't know if that answers that, Ben, or not, but sometimes we talk about positions and we think it's a person and it's maybe a...
Yeah, reframe that, Ben. It doesn't sound like we've answered it.
I'm not, so...
No, it actually does answer my question. Okay. So obviously there's a difference between an employee versus an FTE, right? But you're saying opening up FTEs in case something happens, we might migrate an employee that's otherwise, having to move, they might go there. That's what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, thank you. That did answer my question. Thank you.
The only other thing I would add is because we're balancing into what we need, we have some positions being reduced while we're adding 3 PE positions. And that there's a structural unemployment there. Someone who's laid off at a middle school or a position that's reduced at a middle school, that person may not have the licensure to just move into another subject at another grade level.
Like at Periwinkle School, it was the perfect scenario. We had 3 third-grade classes. The student count only requires 2. We have a 4th grade teacher retiring, so 1 person will shift, and the school is totally balanced without any adverse effect. They're not all that nice, but that one worked out good.
Question from Eric?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. When I do my budget every year, the very last thing I put in my budget is morale. And I understand budgets are really tight and it's tough when you're a public entity. But it might be our facilities building an awning for a school so the teachers don't have to wait out, or the staff don't have to wait out in the rain. Or it may be, half a contact day or a no contact day coming back from a holiday. Have we looked at anything we can do to build that morale and have a small contingency in our budget? That should have been a typed in question. I apologize.
Or maybe 3 months ago. We have not considered any thing like that. I think one of the challenges that you get is 20 schools, right? And so that can become a number about, and it's going to look different, right? So there would have to have been more time than we had to investigate that. I do think one of the things that we can do is just really simplify and focus our teachers into learning, like really focusing in areas of improvement that they can all improve on together and that they can attend to without having 8 things to improve upon at any one time. That has come across to me when I meet with the union. That is a very stressful, stress-inducing feeling, because when there are 8, you can't be good at all of them, and there's a sinking feeling there.
And there may be things, like you mentioned, buy new computers for staff. So if you're not rebooting your computer 8 times a day, it can help your morale for sure.
Thank you.
Moving on? All right.
I think that's it. Oh, there's one more slide.
Did I go
But-
the wrong way?
Yeah, that's the one. So I know that Roger had spoken about this, and I think Grant has said the same thing. And so I just threw this slide in to remind everybody what the 23-25 biennium looks like in terms of revenue. And if you'll remember, we are going from 15 million to 12.5 million, 12.5, not 12, to 10 across these years. So Roger had mentioned this the other night, that there is a declining ending fund balance, and I think the word was deficit spending. I think Grant said the same thing. For us to not decline the 15 million essentially means that we would not use it, which would then mean that our program is going to be at that 23-25 number. And that would mean a lot of cuts, which have been created because of a revenue shortfall that is not based on the economy. It is based on a kicker of 5.5 billion going back. And so the number that we are planning to finish at the end of the biennium is, by policy, the required 8% of our budget. And so it is the use of the additional ending fund balance in order to bridge that with as small a harm as possible to the programs that we have. And you can see the projections for revenue do increase in the out years. I don't think that's a substantial increase to the economy. It is simply, if you looked at that and saw the trend line, you can see the missing kicker. And so there is some deficit spending here, but that is a planned use of that in order to bridge that, and we can continue to work on our fiscal performance. For example, the exception time cards, those sort of things. We can, once we put eyes on it and monitor that, we can begin to perform in our budgets. But the use of 700,000 per year would mean, right, and you'll recall that was a priority, 15 million to 12.5 would actually go 15 million, 13 and a quarter, right, and then 10 3/4, as opposed to 15, 12.5, 10. We would be allocating 1.5 million across 2 years to slow that rate, and we would then be above our minimum by policy requirement of 8%. That's the thinking there. To go down to that number, I believe, would force a lot of damage. It would force us to find several $1 million, if we're spending $3 million of the ending fund balance, to balance that and keep it at 15%, or 15 million, I'm sorry, that's about 13.5%, would force a lot of cuts and a lot of discontinuity to our programs.
You can respond. I'll give you one.
I'm sure
minute.
there's some fiscal conservatives in
Thank
here.
you, Madam Chair. Well, look, here's the trend in local government over the last 20 years. Our expenses go up 5 to 8% a year in payroll costs, and our revenues go up 3 to 5%. So every year we have to reinvent ourselves at 2% of less than we were before. And what we're doing is if we don't work hard and throughout the year to reduce that number to something lower every way we can, we're spending down our reserves to a month's worth of operations, I think. And we're creating a budget cliff 2 years from now if the state revenue doesn't come back and fund us at a much higher level. And history would indicate that's not likely. So it's very concerning, and I hope that one eye is on that with the additional revenue as it comes in at whatever number it does. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think that's a fair point, and I think that's why I'm inviting all of you Budget Committee members to re-up and stick around, and we can kind of watch this unfold over these 2 years and see if we can perform under that budget number so that we can carry more into the next year than we plan and make this 2-year glide path work.
Any questions on that? All right.
Not a question, but a comment. I appreciate Roger's comments around the fiscal need to sort of beat the trend, because you're right. If you sort of always kick the can down the road, eventually that 2% becomes 4 and then 6. And I think that this graph here, I think is an excellent reason why you'd use it. My question last meeting was about what the policy amount is for that reserve, because we've talked about this reserve for as many years as I've been on the Budget Committee. And we've always had an amount, but never a policy of what that percentage was. So I'm comfortable that the percentage that we're meeting, even with the recommendation, is still okay. But I absolutely think we should monitor that going forward so that we can say, okay, now we're at whatever percent that is. We need to sort of trend that out and figure out how we're going to make that sustainable. Because, yeah, I hope that your random numbers here are correct going out that far. But who knows what, nobody projected what happened in 2020, 21. So hopefully not again.
I think that's why it's important that if we do make add backs, we don't just add back all the positions, but try to find a sustainable level with our reduced student counts.
All right. Anything else? Anything else on your?
No, I think that's
presentation?
what we're looking at there is the essential fundamental challenge of this biennium. I feel very fortunate to have had Jane come here. She is highly skilled, not only knows where to look to find things, but knows what she's looking at when she sees them. And so there's still more learning to do, I think, as we go forward. But it is incredibly important that as we structure ourselves, and I just want to point this out, the last 2 ending fund balances that you have seen, there were many things that Jane has now created funds for that reduce that, right? Because now we have specific funds. And I'll give you an example. We have always allowed buildings to keep 20% of their building fund and carry it over before, and that has never been budgeted. So the ending fund balance you've looked at the last 2 years had about $250,000 that was already allocated and was going to be spent by the buildings from the prior year budget. So cleaning these things up and establishing a fund and a budgeted number helps really true up the ending fund balance. And I think it allows us to work positively against that balance, by which I mean grow it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Did you have a question?
For you.
All right, are we moving on? Did we include discussion and questions, or are we moving on to that section? Is there any final?
I have a question. Are we hiring a new EDI director?
Yes, we are. We're going to reconvene the committee. We are currently working on a proposal with Lynn Benton Community College to build greater depth in that department by some sharing. And I'm hopeful that we can arrive at that, and then we'll pull the committee back together with that. But just want to confirm the EDI position is a leadership team level position. It's in the budget.
Do we, and maybe this isn't the right place for the question, but as a budget committee member watching the last few years, with the changing of positions, so with the firing of people and then, or, not renewing contracts and then contracts where people aren't in place and the things going on right now, how did that affect the budget? Was that money spent that we didn't have in the budget, or where does that money come from when you're paying out a contract or, and then rehiring for that and the expenses that come with that?
So, and I saw a couple of questions about that. The position that Mr. Bolin occupies and that Mrs. Knopfziger occupy pre-existed. The difference has been that I just believe that the business manager is fundamentally important as a direct report, right? So that we can gain control of this. But all other positions are budgeted next year. No additional money is budgeted. So assistant superintendent, it is budgeted. No additional second position or anything like that is budgeted.
More of a comment, and concern as we move forward. I'm hoping, and I know, Jane, you are, that we're keeping an eye on the fiscal cliff that's coming. We've talked about it for a lot of times. It's people need to understand this thing is looming, and we really need to keep our eye towards holding on to a little money to mitigate that potential disaster, because there really exists out there the potential in a couple of years, if this doesn't go the way we project, to really have to do draconian cuts. And we're trying to keep the talent that we've worked so hard for, and that keep our kids educated and keep our schools safe and clean, and get our kids back and forth to school. So if there are places where we could reserve some of those funds, and I know there was an option in there, I certainly favor that option as opposed to trying to restore spending levels to the way they were the last couple of years, where we had extraordinary income that we just can't reasonably accept or expect to see in the future.
Yeah, one of the things that I did not include, but is important, is the state's reserve funds. So the corporate income tax, the state's rainy day fund, the education rainy day fund, those numbers are projected to be healthy moving forward. So generally, you will see the state's reserve fund and our reserve funds utilized in some form. We might contribute some. The state also may allocate some of those. They began, or they're ending this year with they had about a 20% reserve fund in total balance to the state budget. 5-10 years ago, they generally assumed that 7% would be needed to get through an average recession. They have used down to about 8% right now, and I can share that with the board at a meeting, but they have used down to 8%. They've spent from 20% down to 12% to hold these funding levels up at this point. And so they're looking more at a number that would get through a reasonable recession. I can share you that with the board at the next meeting.
All right, are we ready to, okay, go ahead.
So we've noticed a decline in enrolled students over the past few years. I think last meeting we talked a little bit about where we think that's coming from. I guess I would like that to also be a part of kind of the strategic understanding of what, are we going to continue to either just not be having as many kids through the pipeline, or is there something about the district that we can improve to keep our community coming here for education? That also gives us a better chance at a steady income from the state? Or is there a concern that we're going to continue to decline?
Yes, very much so. I think one of the things we need to do is begin to engage our parents in those reasons. And I think I shared with you the 3 reasons why I am concerned about that, and that it is a long-term trend. I think I had mentioned that we actually budgeted last year on half of what we thought the increase would be, and we actually didn't see that. So coming to an understanding about that, I think, is going to be fundamentally important to our work in the district.
I also, last year, there was some information shared around the teacher to student ratio, and that was based on research done by Hattie, meta-analysis saying that this is what we need for good outcomes, right? We know that there's been a lot of learning loss. There have been issues. I'm a little concerned when you say Salem-Kaiser, right? The way they get around having, you have less staff to student, and that makes sense. You have less FTE you're paying. So I guess this is more of a comment, but thinking about that, what is our happy place to be in, right? What works for our district that is sustainable, but we're not putting students behind? And I'm really concerned about students in poverty, as well as, I've looked at the different data before pandemic, after pandemic, looking at scores, usually in science because that's my background. And over the bridge, so meaning on this, over where I live on the south side, our scores are not as good. We don't have, students that are not as smart as the ones on the other side closer to Corvallis. So I just want to make sure that we're really being intentional about how we ensure equitable outcomes. MTSS is supposed to be helping us with some of that. How do we know that we're getting there and that we're making improvement? And as a community member, I want to know that that's something that I can get regular information on, right? I can know that we are making progress towards this goal, and that the things we budgeted for are being successful or not, right? That we learned, no, we need to change course.
So I think Mr. Nyquist's interest and, the idea, let's compensate really well. Anything, I think, in education has a string to every other outcome and factor that we think about. So to tug on that at the cost of class size really indicates that we would need to be very strategic in terms of how we do that and balance those competing, because really it's probably far more even than that in terms of complexity. And so I think that will take time and engagement and study in terms of developing a balanced budget that reflects balance in components, with that as something that we're going to have to be mindful of. We have talked about implementing a slightly more student-based by need staffing ratio and building ratio, where we can hopefully do that. But the really interesting thing there is that still is a ratio. So there are kids even at schools with lower ratios that need just as much help. It may be poverty in one area, ELL students in another.
Yeah.
So fairly complex.
Okay, are we ready to make motions?
I had one question. The Budget Committee website says that tonight would also include input from the public. Is that on tonight's agenda or no?
That's where a lot of the questions came from.
Excuse me, but is that going to be the whole extent of the public input? My questions are not on there. For example, I would appreciate if we could have public input. I think it's important. Unless there's some obstacle to that. I sent you my questions, I didn't see them.
Mr. Superintendent, wouldn't we have to allow for video and audio call-ins to the meeting?
Excuse me, but isn't it more
I'm sorry,
important to have the
a
public
question to the table.
heard from?
I
It
think,
was advertised that this meeting would include public input. It was advertised that way. It was publicly put out.
I think that the committee members have the questions and they could ask them. I think that would be fine.
I think you're afraid we might say something.
But I think those questions are fine.
Mr. Nyquist, for example, painted a rosy picture of how much teachers should be paid so we can attract the best. But the reputation of the Greater Albany Public School has suffered greatly because of the actions of our present school board. And I can give specific examples and I can name names, but I would prefer not to at this point. If you want to know why people are not flocking to the Greater Albany Public Schools, it's because they have heard what actually happens and how people who are competent and doing their jobs can lose them at the whim of the school board. About how the public in Albany used to be able to speak freely to the school board, but now no longer can. It is true that. when
Madam
we
Chair,
saw
point of order.
Harlan's
If we're gonna allow input from we're actually against state statute right now.
No, I don't think so.
We have to allow video and audio input
think-
if we take input from the audience.
Okay.
I think you need to know that when Lisa Harlan was
Madam Chair.
Sorry, I understand your,
no, you don't.
actually, I actually very much think
Give me an example of how you understand, please.
how I
Yeah,
understand.
so I know you understand.
As a Black person in this school district, I have tried to have people hear us and for me to present public comment on the N-word being out of control in our schools. So I do understand.
But we have this facade where the board appears to do the right thing, but is actually a political arm. And when Lisa Harlan's.
I've got 15 minutes and then I'd like to go home to my 4 children before they go to
Okay,
bed.
all right, okay, wait, can you put, I don't think that's fair. I can't give you 5, what okay, here's my problem with this. You asked me to be the chair and I've got no resources.
I completely understand.
I have
don't
no
fault you
idea
one
what to
bit.
do in this situation. And so that is why I understand that. And
Why
so,
did you do that if you weren't gonna do it?
well, I'm also not the person to ask.
Madam
I don't,
Chair,
so
might we take a 5-minute recess?
sure, let's take a 5-minute recess. I would appreciate,
Thank you.
Are you gonna come back?
well, we will come back.
Every one of you? I hope so. There are issues.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any disapprove, or
Ma-
negative?
Madam Chair, I would move approval of the special revenue funds in the amount of $35,095,873.
Second.
I will second.
Our wonderful district.
All in approval?
Aye.
Aye.
Madam Chair, I would move approval of the debt service funds in the amount of $22,413,950.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Madam Chair, I move approval of the capital project fund in the amount of $13,936,812.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Madam Chair, I would move approval of the intern service fund in the amount of $105,000.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Madam Chair, I move that the Greater Albany Public Schools District 8J Budget Committee approves the property taxes for the 2023-2024 fiscal year at the rate of $4.5855, 4.5855 per 1,000 of assessed value for the permanent tax rate levy, and in the amount of $15,550,450 for the general obligation bond levy.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Madam Chair, I move we adjourn.
Second? All right, we're adjourned.
Please.